Hello and welcome to ABS Web, the American Bonanza Society's monthly webinar program. I'm Tom Turner, Executive Director of the American Bonanza Society's Air Safety Foundation. This time we're going to talk about fuel management strategies in the various models of Beechcraft airplanes. As much as 90% of all reported engine failures in Beech airplanes come as a result of fuel mismanagement on the part of the pilot. By better understanding your fuel system, you'll be able to avoid the vast majority of in-flight engine failures, as well as to employ a safer safety margin throughout your entire flight envelope. Before we get started, we'll go through a few of the preliminaries. This program, like all ABS Web webinars, is recognized by the FAA Wings program for Wings credit. If you'd like to earn Wings credit for having seen this presentation, once you're complete, go back to the entry page, the one you used, the link that you used to find this program in the first place, and locate the FAA Wings credit link at the right. Click on that link and you'll go to a short quiz administered by the Wings program. At the completion of that quiz, you'll earn a course completion certificate, and those points will be awarded toward your FAA Wings record. This program is also recognized by the American Bonanza Society's ABS Aviator program. ABS Aviator is our in-house version of the Wings program, and we recognize and encourage pilots who seek out additional training that makes them a better Beechcraft pilot. If you'd like to get ABS Aviator credit for this program, when you get that FAA Wings course completion certificate, email a copy of it to us at info@bonanza.org, or send a copy into the ABS headquarters office in Wichita, and we'll apply that record for you. If you want to learn more about the ABS Aviator program, you can find information about that at bonanza.org. For those persons watching this program live, you have the opportunity to ask your questions. Type in your questions using the chat function in the webinar viewing program. I'll take a break about midway through this program, and then at the end to address as many of your questions as I can during that time. Lastly, this program will be archived probably the day after it goes live. This program will be archived on the ABS website under the training menu, and then the ABS Web Webinars link. So you can view it again if you like, focus on one of the highlights if you want to look at a particular part of it, or forward that link to another member so that they can view what you've seen here tonight. So let's move on and talk about fuel strategies. Now, when we talk about fuel strategies or any sort of management strategy in your airplane, there are really two different components. Procedures, and those are things that are either absolutely required or recommended in the official handbooks, and then techniques, which are things you can do to meet the procedures or to follow the procedures. In the case of fuel management, there are three types of procedures that we're going to look at in this program. Aircraft limitations, which are mandatory in all cases except emergencies. Checklists, which are recommendations from the factory on how to operate the equipment. And then the systems description section of the pilot's operating handbook, which describes in a little more detail about how things work and perhaps how you might work them. On the techniques side, we're going to employ different ways of attaining the goals of the procedures. We're going to talk about how and when to switch fuel tanks when that's appropriate to your Beechcraft. We'll cover a little bit about fuel monitoring, and especially knowing where your fuel is in which tank in the various models of Beech airplanes. We'll talk about the variations between those models and highlight some of the system gotchas, the things that can make things go wrong if you don't understand how those systems work and operate them correctly. The overall goal of this program is to encourage you to follow some fuel management best practices that have been learned over decades of flying these airplanes, and give you some ideas for developing your own personal airplane-specific fuel management strategy that is specific and targeted to the systems in the airplane that you fly. To get started, though, we'll look at the fuel management procedures, those things that are in the aircraft's pilot's operating handbook and the airplane flight manual, limitations, checklist actions, and then some notes from the systems description. First, the limitations. And again, these are things that are regulatory. These are things that you have to do. Everything else is a recommendation, and you don't necessarily have to do it the way that the book suggests, as long as you don't violate any of these limitations. The first limitation is that in virtually all of our airplanes, there is a minimum fuel for takeoff limitation. And in, again, almost all of the models, there is a yellow arc on the fuel tank or fuel gauge or gauges in the aircraft. The limitation that applies to everything except for travelers and the 56 TCs, which don't have this limitation, is that you must have at least the yellow arc or more of fuel in both main tanks to take off. Now, the yellow arc is for the Model 35 through the J35 is 10 gallons, which is actually at the half tank level for most of those airplanes. For all the other models of ABS type airplane, it's 13 gallons aside to take off. And that's about 3/8 in most of the airplanes. When you get into Barons and into 36TC, B36TCs, it's even a little less than that, down around the quarter tank level. But in virtually all cases, the minimum requirement is 13 gallons aside, except in the earlier VTOL airplanes. This becomes a bit of a trick if you are, for example, taking or conducting a BPPP flight, or any instructional flight where you may be doing multiple takeoffs and landings, because you have to time your flight training so that you do not violate this minimum limitation for takeoff for every subsequent takeoff you want to make. In other words, if you go up and do some stalls and then go do some takeoffs and landings, you'll have to keep an eye on the fuel gauges to avoid violating this limitation. And you may have to do a fuel stop and top off with fuel in order to remain within the legal limitations of the aircraft. But regardless, this is one of the limitations that does apply. It applies to fuel in both main tanks, even in the single engine airplanes. The next limitation actually isn't a limitation so much, except that it is mentioned in the handbook. You have a certain amount of unusable fuel in the various fuel tank systems in the Beech airplanes. And you can find exactly how much unusable fuel you have in your individual aircraft in both the limitations section and in the systems description section of your pilot's operating handbook. Now, your fuel gauges are required to be calibrated so that they read the empty level when you have just unusable fuel in the aircraft. Now, they're also required to be accurate across the entire range, and it's a misnomer that they're only required to be accurate at empty, because that is not the case. But they are required to read empty when you have just the unusable fuel remaining on board, and they need to be at least reasonably accurate across the entire range of operation of your fuel gauges. Now, there's often some discussion about unusable fuel. Unusable fuel may be available in cruise flight at times. It's going to be more of a function of whether or not the airplane is in coordinated flight, what the G load might be, and the pitch attitude of the aircraft, whether or not you may get into that unusable fuel. So, as I believe I'll get to at the end of the program here, but I'll make sure I say it now, you may be able to use that unusable fuel, but don't count on it. Don't include unusable fuel in your flight planning. Now, many of you see some YouTube videos by Scott Gunny Purdue. He posted one very recently that I found to be very, very interesting. And if you want to see this and any of the other of Scott's, Scott is a BPPP instructor. He flies an aerobatic Bonanza and an A36. And he's doing quite a bit of video work. And he did one recently on fuel unporting. And what he found was that in a descent pitch attitude, His bonanza may unport, in other words, get to a point where the fuel in the tank can no longer be picked up and transferred to the engine, when he has as much as 6 or 7 gallons of fuel indicated remaining in that tank. And he's got very accurate fuel gauges in his aircraft. So if you're interested, you could look for Gunny Purdue on YouTube, or Flywire is his channel, and see one of his most recent videos, which is fuel starvation, especially in descent mode. But the interesting thing about this, I think, is that he found fairly consistently that in a cruise descent pitch attitude, the fuel may unport at even a little bit more than the unusable fuel level. And that supports something that we've been teaching in BPPP for a very long time, and I'll reiterate later in the program in the techniques portion, which is to make your final fuel selection for descent, approach, and landing at the point where you begin your descent from cruise flight. And you'll be switching to a tank with more fuel than a minimum amount, like Scott found here. And consequently, you will avoid this unporting in a descent attitude scenario. Another limitation that applies to virtually all of these airplanes, the ABS type airplanes, is a maximum slip limitation. If your airplane has unbaffled fuel tanks, and that's generally 1960s and earlier airplanes, although those may have been retrofitted with baffled tanks later on. If you have unbaffled tanks, there's a maximum slip duration of 20 seconds. If you have baffled tanks, it's 30 seconds, with the exception of the B36TC, which is a 1-minute maximum slip duration limitation. Strangely, the Barons all have 30 seconds, with the exception of the 58TC and the 58P, which have no stated slip limitation at all. Now, this is describing a fairly steep slip where you have aileron hard over in one direction and rudder pretty much over in the other direction. And consequently, this puts the airplane in a wing low attitude, and also in one at which the nose is skewed away from the direction of flight of the aircraft. And that downhill wing, if you have less than an absolutely full tank, that downhill wing, the fuel is going to slosh outboard away from the fuel pickups, and consequently can cause the engine to quit after it burns that fuel that's already available between the fuel selector and the cylinders. At the same time, the skewing of the nose away from the direction of flight and the uphill tank may cause the fuel to flow aft and away from that fuel pickup as well. And that's why these limitations exist. The good news is that these airplanes slip beautifully, and that in a fully developed slip, you will lose a substantial amount of altitude in 15 or 20 seconds. So the chances that you would be in a fully developed slip for a very long period of time, more than the limitation time, is pretty remote. However, remember, if you're doing an extended final in a strong crosswind, or for any other reason you're trying to do a steep slip for an extended period of time, that you do have this limitation to avoid causing the fuel to unport, which in turn, of course, would cause the engine to quit. Another similar limitation applies to unbaffled tanks. They'll have a statement that says turning takeoffs are prohibited. And what they're talking about here is where you make a relatively fast and continuous turn from the taxiway into the runway and immediately begin your takeoff roll. Again, if the fuel tank is not very nearly full, and also if you happen to have selected the tank that is on the outside of your turn as you turn into position, that fuel will slosh away from the pickups and the engine will quit at some point, maybe 20 seconds further down the runway, when the fuel that's between the fuel selector and the engine runs out. So if you have an airplane with unbaffled fuel tanks, turn into position, pause momentarily, and then begin your takeoff roll. For those airplanes that have auxiliary fuel, whether we're talking about factory installed auxiliary tanks in the wings or in the earlier airplanes, the aft baggage compartment, or we're talking about auxiliary fuel tip tanks that were installed either at the factory or aftermarket that directly feed the engine. not those with transfer pumps that refill the main tanks, but those that actually run the fuel to the engine itself. If you have any auxiliary fuel tanks, those are limited to level flight operation only. So you level off, switch to the aux tanks if you want to use them, switch back to a main tank, or in the Baron's main tanks or Traveler's main tanks before you begin your descent. In the single engine airplanes with auxiliary fuel, use at least 10 gallons from the left main tank before you turn on the auxiliary. And this is to give us room for return fuel. And we'll talk about return fuel in a little bit. Yet another limitation, another legal limitation on the operation of our airplanes is that on 1947 through 1960 model Bonanzas and the first 2 years of Debonair production, the limitation is to take off on the left main tank. And for reasons that will become clear when we talk about return fuel routing later, we need to burn fuel out of the left tank before we use any other tank so that the return fuel has somewhere to go without being pushed overboard through the vents. Barons that have, Barons also and Travelers have a limitation that cross-feed operation may be used only in emergency conditions in level flight only. Cross-feed is a system where you take fuel from one side, let's say the tank's on the right side of the aircraft, and route it over to run the left engine. So you might be operating both engines at the same time off of the right wing. Or you may be doing this to get fuel from the left wing if the left engine is shut down to run the right engine to extend your time aloft or to balance the aircraft. The cross-feed is limited to emergency conditions and, again, level flight only in those airplanes that have cross-feed. Lastly, this isn't in the pilot's operating handbook, but it is in the supplement to many autopilots. Many autopilots have a maximum fuel imbalance. For example, the ABS Air Safety Foundation A36 has a Garmin GFC 600 autopilot, one of the newest autopilots from Garmin. And in its supplement in the handbook, it has a limitation, legally binding limitation that says there can be no more than a 15-gallon fuel imbalance, left wing versus right, when you're operating the autopilot. It's programmed to operate that way, and so it is something that we need to adhere to as well. So everything that we've covered so far are limitations on the fuel systems on our airplanes. They're found in Section 2, the limitations section of the handbook, or in the case of the Debonair and the 56TCs, really, and Travelers. They're found in the owner's manual in a limitations section there. And these are things that are actually legally binding from an FAA standpoint. And more importantly, they are ways to avoid some of the gotchas that can cause an engine stoppage because of fuel starvation if you were to operate contrary to these limitations. From here, we're going to move on to checklist actions, recommendations from the factory about operating these airplanes. Something you'll see in virtually every airplane that has selectable tanks is a note that says take off on the fullest main tank, or in the case of the Barons, on the main tanks and not the auxiliaries. What it's telling us there is it's not a limitation, but the recommendation is to make sure that the fuel tank we use for takeoff has more fuel than anything else in it. Interestingly, this checklist step does not appear on the before takeoff checklist. In fact, it appears on the before starting checklist in our handbooks. And the suggestion here is, yes, you should select the fullest main tank before you take off, but you need to do that well before takeoff so that we don't accidentally interrupt fuel flow to the engine by not quite getting the fuel selector moved properly just before we try to take off. So when the checklist tells us select the fullest main tank for takeoff, it is not telling us to make that selection just before we line up to take off, to taxi out onto the runway or to line up. We make that selection before we ever leave the taxiway. It's not a step on the before takeoff or the takeoff checklists, but on the before starting checklist. Similarly, there is a step that tells us to make sure we land on the fullest main tank. It is on the before landing checklist. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in detail later on in the techniques portion. But remember, this is not a limitation. This is a recommendation from the factory. And we're going to modify that recommendation just a little bit ourselves at ABS to ensure that you make this selection somewhere even before close to the ground where you might be doing a before landing checklist. All right, so we talked about limitations and checklists. We're going to get into the systems description section handbook of in just a moment. But first, I'm going to answer a couple of questions that have popped up. The first is there any mechanism Bonanza pilots can use to visually verify fuel levels besides the tabs? And the answer is really no. As you know, because of the dihedral of our wings and the fact that the fuel cap consequently has to be out toward the outward end of the fuel bladders, if you burn very much fuel at all out of a tank, you won't see any amount of fuel in that tank when you look in the fuel filler port. So we can't dip these tanks like you can do it in, say, a Cessna 172, which has little to no dihedral on a flat tank. Several of the models, some of the later E55 Barons, the T58 TCs and Ps, and the B36 TCs have a small float sight gauge in the wing. There's actually on the outside of the wing, inboard of the fuel filler port, there's a gauge. You can look at that and it will be accurate within a certain range of fuel, so you can judge a partial fuel level. But we need to monitor our fuel level based on a known amount of fuel put into the aircraft and accurate monitoring of the fuel flow, the fuel burn out of that aircraft, based on fuel gauges, totalizers, and a few other things that I'll get into in a bit. But we can't dip these tanks. It just doesn't work. Second question, how long do the fuel bladders last in a Baron on average before they need to be replaced? Of course, they generally can go until you find a sign of detection. Our technical advisors will tell us that they expect to get about 20 years use out of a fuel bladder tank, assuming that the owner has kept the tank full or very nearly full when the airplane's idle on the ground, so that the vapors in the fuel keep the top side of the bladder lubricated. If that bladder dries out, it will crack and leak much sooner. 20 years on average, according to our technical advisors. I've heard several people get a lot longer time out of them, but anytime you've got more than 20 years, start to think about having the fuel bladders overhauled or replaced. The first tabs question was from an E33 owner, so okay, good enough. Another one, if you have a 1960 M35, is it okay to take off on the right main if that is the fullest tank between the left and the right main tanks? Yes, it is. And again, we're going to talk about return fuel and the impact it has on auxiliary fuel in a little bit. But yes, in that vintage of airplane, you can take off on the right tank first. That's just fine. You still need to burn fuel out of the left tank before you switch to auxiliary tanks if you have them, because the auxiliary tank return fuel is going to go to the left side. And lastly, before we move on, in Baron, talking about crossfeed, by level flight, is that bank or pitch or both? It says level flight. It doesn't say straight and level flight. So the interpretation there, as long as you maintain altitude or pitch, really, it's okay. If you have to make a turn, you don't have to switch to the main tanks to, when ATC tells you to turn left 30 degrees or anything like that at all. So you can switch to the auxiliaries in level flight and operate on the auxiliaries. But as soon as you are ready to begin an altitude change, you need to select the main tanks for that altitude change. All right, keep your questions coming. We'll answer more in the future. We're now going to take a look at the systems description and a few notes that I have about things that you will find in the systems description of your airplane's pilot's operating handbook. Specifically, those fuel-related items that are going to be somewhere in the mid-range of the systems description in your POH. The first I've already mentioned in the context of answering a question, In virtually all of the tanks in our airplanes are rubber bladder type tanks, the exception being the wingtip wet wings on 58s, 58Ps, TCs, and some of the later model 55s, E55s, and 56TC, A56TC. Those that have the wet wingtip tank, that is a metal tank. Everything else is a fuel bladder in all of the vintage of our airplanes, and you need to keep it, with the exception, of course, I'm sorry, one more, the baggage compartment auxiliary tanks in the very early V-tails. If you have a rubber bladder tank, you need to keep it full or fairly near full so that you've got fuel lubrication and fuel vapor lubrication to keep the top inside of the tank from drying out between flights. Now, we talked a little bit about fuel return, and now we're going to look at it in a lot more detail. Fuel return has two factors that you need to take into consideration. The first is the rate, how fast the fuel return flows. Now, by fuel return, I mean fuel is coming from a tank, it's going into the engine area, and eventually most of that fuel is going to be burned, combusted by the engine. However, in most of the ABS type airplanes, there is some circulation of fuel back to the fuel tanks. It's a pressure relief system, and it's also part of the venting system to circulate this fuel back. Now, with the exception of the B95A, none of the travel airs have any return fuel at all. The P-Baron, the 58TC, the 56TC, and the A56TC, none of those have return fuel. They have different types of fuel injection systems, or in some cases, carbureted systems that do not have a fuel return. The E-Series airplanes, the Model 35 through the H35, which has the 0470, those have a fuel return rate of 3 gallons per hour. Basically, well, in the B95A, I can't find anywhere that specifies exactly what the rate of return fuel is. I suspect it's probably in the 3 gallon per hour range. Everything else in our airplanes has a return fuel rate of about 10 gallons per hour. Now, I've broken this down by engine type, but by airplane type, but the reality is it's engine based. The rate of fuel return is a function of the engine installed in the airplane, not the airframe itself. And by that, I mean, if you have, for example, a G35 Bonanza, which would normally have a 3 gallon per hour fuel return rate, and you install an IO520 on it, for example, it now will have a fuel return rate of 10 gallons per hour. So it's based on the engine, not the airframe. The second consideration about return fuel is where that fuel goes, which tank it goes to after it comes back from the engine. In the 35 through the H35, it goes directly to the left main tank. No matter where the fuel is coming from in those airplanes, the return fuel goes to the left tank. In the J35 through the M35 and the early Debonairs, the left main goes to the left tank, the right main goes to the right tank, and auxiliary fuel, return fuel, always goes to the left main tank. And this is the where the answer to that question about the M35 came from. Yes, you can take off on the right tank if you want, but you still have to burn out of the left tank before you can use the aux fuel. And the later airplanes, N35 and after, B33 and after, all the 36s, the fuel goes to the tank in use. In the B95A and the Barons with return fuel, it all goes to the tank in use, even if you have auxiliaries. And if you have tip tanks that are direct feed type, they will always go to the left tank. So it gets confusing. There's been a lot of information on these last couple of slides. And that's why I encourage you to take a look at the systems description and the diagram of the fuel system that is in section 7, the systems description section of your pilot's operating handbook. And make sure that you understand the system as it exists in the airplane you're flying today. And it's going to be different from one to another. Now, the rate of return fuel is a function of the engine, and can change if you modify the engine. But the tank to which return fuel goes is a function of the airframe unless you have an STC that also changes the routing of return fuel. So it's almost always going to be standard, even if you swap engines. And then that's why all of these limitations I've highlighted here make sense. In the airplanes that are highlighted here have us take off on the left main tank first. And that's because that's where the return fuel is going to go. And they tell us to burn at least 10 gallons of fuel out of there before you use the auxiliary fuel. All right, so lots of information about return fuel, but it's vital that you understand that. And we're going to come back and talk about that just a little bit more in the context of fuel management in a bit. All right, fuel indication can be a bit of a gotcha as well in some of our airplanes. In the 35 through the H-35, you have one fuel gauge. No matter how many tanks you've got, you have one fuel gauge, and you have to change a selector on that gauge to determine which tank it is indicating. So you'll select left, right, or auxiliary as appropriate to your airplane. In the J-35 through the M's and the first 2 years of debonaires, you have two gauges, one for the mains and one for the auxes. And if you switch main tanks, you've got to also switch the fuel gauge to ensure that you are monitoring the tank that you're actually using. All of the other bonanzas and debonaires have independent gauges for each tank. Tip tanks are going to be per the STC, whether it's a visual sight gauge on the tank itself, a fuel gauge added with the modification to your panel, or in some cases, no indicator at all. In the twin engine Beechcraft, we have similar situations in the Travelairs and basically 1961 through 73 model Barons, 55 models anyhow, you have one gauge for each wing, and you can select whether you're using the main tank or displaying the main tank or the auxiliary tank. So when you switch tanks, you need to switch the selectors. On all of the other Beech twins, you have independent gauges for each tank. There's also this one other gotcha for those airplanes that have the wet wingtip long-range tanks. The fuel gauges are still calibrated. Even if you have those long-range tanks, those fuel gauges are calibrated to read full when the main tanks are full. And they do not begin to show a reduction in fuel level until you burn down below the main tank level. So if you were to fill those airplanes completely up, including auxiliary fuel, then you would see the fuel gauges stay on the full level for a long time before they start to decrease after you've burned down quite a bit of fuel. I will talk about auxiliary fuel pumps, which is also another issue that sometimes causes a little bit of confusion for folks, and it's because it's different from among our different models of our airplanes. First, the 35s through the H-35s do not have an electric auxiliary fuel pump. They have wobble pumps. There is an aftermarket electric emergency pump available. You still have to have an operable wobble pump if you have that installed, but in most of the airplanes of those vintages, there is no electric auxiliary fuel pump. N35 through V35Bs, all debonaires, the E35As and Cs, F33As and Cs, basically early airplanes through about 1983 model A36s, you have an on-off pump. These are essentially with some exceptions, these are the IO520 airplanes, also some of the IO470N airplanes. They have an on-off pump. And then everybody else has a high, low, and off pump. Interestingly, in early A36TCs, they had two separate switches, but those were usually consolidated. There was a service bulletin later on, and every A36TC I've ever been in has a single auxiliary fuel pump switch. In the twin engine airplanes, almost everybody has an on-off pump, with the exception of some of the 520 and all of the 550 airplanes. which have a high, low, and off pump position. So we'll talk about how those different positions are used. For those who have an on or off pump, some of the models, those listed in the first line here, call to have the pump turned on for takeoff and landing. The B95A calls for it to be turned off for takeoff and landing. Later travel layers have a note that says, as conditions require for takeoff and landing. We're going to talk about that here in just a moment in the context of the low position. And all of the Bonanzas and Debonairs require that the fuel pump be off for takeoff and landing. For those that have the high and low position, the high position of fuel flow is the same fuel pressure as the on position in an airplane with an on-off pump. And then the low position is a very low pressure designed primarily to dampen out any fuel vaporization on a hot day. And that's what it's used for, and that's what the recommendations are used for. In the Barons that have a high, low, off pump, the recommendation is to turn it on to the low position for takeoff if the ambient temperature exceeds 90 degrees Fahrenheit, about 32 Celsius. And that's to proactively prevent fuel vaporization because of this hot temperature. Bonanzas that have this high, low, off pump, the handbooks tell us to use the low pump if fuel vaporization or fluctuation is noted in climb. So it's not a limitation. You could turn it on low proactively if you wanted to on a hot day, just like you would in a Baron. But in both of these cases, the use of the low position is to compensate for high engine compartment temperatures that cause fuel fluctuations and consequently variations in power development. There's a note, and I wrote high, but it also applies to on in those airplanes that just have the on-off switches. There's a note in the systems description of most of our handbooks that says the high boost pump position should not be used in flight unless you have a failure of the engine-driven fuel pump. If you do turn the pump to the high or the on position in flight and the engine-driven pump is operating, under some conditions, this will flood the engine and may actually cause the engine to quit altogether. So in general, you do not use the high position in flight unless you've had a total engine failure, and that's one of the things that you might try to restart a failed engine. Some STCs, especially turbo normalizer STCs, may provide different guidance about the use of the auxiliary fuel pumps, and that may be supported by those STCs if they have the larger diameter fuel return lines that can support this additional flow as needed. But if you have a turbo normalizer and the STC gives you different guidance, then of course follow that guidance. All right, we have spent a lot of time here talking about procedures and some notes about things that appear in the pilot's operating handbooks or owner's manuals for airplanes. They tell us a great deal about how the system is designed, a little bit about how it works, but very little actually about how we might manage the fuel in our airplane. So now we're going to talk about some suggested techniques because the manufacturer doesn't give us much guidance on how to manage fuel in our airplanes. So let's talk very briefly here in just a series of short, hopefully easily remembered checklist recommendations for different phases of flight. The first is in pre-flight. Determine your fuel flow requirements and confirm in as many ways as possible that you have adequate fuel on board. Before I came to work at ABS, I managed a pair of Barons for a highway construction company in Tennessee. And I flew one of them most of the time. My boss flew the other one most of the time. But there were occasions where we would swap airplanes, or I would fly one that he had flown before me or whatever. So we developed a bit of a technique for verifying fuel levels. First, the airplanes, we would visually check the fuel. And we had a general rule of topping off the tanks after a flight. So almost always the fuel levels were full, and that answered any questions we had about fuel. But there were times when we might have to have a reduced fuel level for weight and balance situations, or maybe for whatever reason we couldn't fuel the airplane when we brought it back home last time, or maybe we're away from the airport and swapping pilots at that point as well. So we had lots of different ways we could check. You can visually check. One of those airplanes had the sight gauges on top of the wing. They all have fuel gauges in the cockpit. We had fuel totalizers that were as good as the information we input into them, but once input correctly, they were very accurate. And we also maintained a little notebook, a spiral notebook in each airplane that we'd write down the takt time and the amount of fuel put on board when we fueled the aircraft. And our rule amongst ourselves was that if any one of those indications was an outlier, if anything looked substantially different from any of the other indications, we would put enough fuel in until we could visually check the fuel, or at least until we could verify that we had enough fuel on board to meet whatever mission requirement we had. So check your fuel quantity in as many ways as possible to avoid possible indication error that might lead to a fuel starvation or exhaustion event. Before you start the airplane, before you ever start the airplane, put the fuel selectors on the main tank position, or in the case of the twins, the main tank's positions. Now, in those airplanes listed here, or anything with the direct feed tip tank, left main tank is recommended for takeoff in those. And that's because of the return fuel routing in most of those models and the auxiliary tanks that exist in, or may exist in, the other ones as well. But select your tanks, a main tank or tanks, before takeoff. If you have an airplane that has a fuel selector, a fuel gauge that has its own selector, then make sure that you select the tank that you're feeding from so you can monitor it properly. And also visually check that the fuel caps are secure so we don't get any siphoning through those. Before takeoff, you are not going to switch tanks, because we're doing our before takeoff checklist somewhere after we've taxied out or something, but you do want to visually check that the fuel selector or selectors are in position. This is especially important in earlier Barons, pre-1974 Barons that have selectors like these depicted here, because it's very easy in the process of sliding across the seats to get to the pilot seat, or if you have, I've seen it where the cable from a headset gets wrapped around a fuel selector, and if you move your head just right, it can actually pull that fuel selector handle out of position. So visually check just before takeoff that the fuel selectors are where you expect them to be. But do not switch tanks between engine run-up and takeoff. Even if you decide you want to burn a little out of the left and then burn a little out of the right to see if you can get good fuel out of both tanks, maybe even the auxes if you want on the ground, make your takeoff selection before you do your engine run-up, and then do not change your fuel selector position until well after you take off and get clear of the ground. In climb, use the same fuel selection you used for takeoff. Generally, I'll climb and I won't make a first fuel selector change until I've leveled off into cruise flight. Something else that I've learned the hard way is take a glance out there. Make it a habit to glance left and right during climb, shortly after takeoff, once you get established in climb, and check your fuel caps to make sure that you don't have any fuel venting overboard. In other words, you don't have any cracks in the seals on your fuel caps, and your fuel caps have been properly secured to the airplane. Even a little bit of a crack or a slightly loose cap can cause a lot of fuel siphoning, and that fuel siphoning overboard is not going to show up on your totalizer because it's not going through the totalizer, the transducer. It will actually, in some cases, give you a false high indication on the fuel gauges. So the only way you're going to check fuel, you're going to detect fuel going overboard from those caps is by taking a look yourself. So just get in the habit of taking a scan left and right to look at the fuel caps once you're established in climb. In cruising flight, if you've used the auxiliary fuel pump for takeoff or for climb because of vaporization or heat, then turn it off before you lean the mixture. Then lean the mixture as desired. I'm not going to get into rich a peak, lean a peak, anything like that at all tonight, except in the context of the amount of fuel that is coming out of the tank. I'll talk about in a bit. But whether or not you fly rich a peak or lean a peak or how you do that, that's a topic for another night. It's a little different from the fuel management discussion. Once again, because of the limitation in cruise, just to put it in your checklist form here, Bonanzas and Debonairs with aux tanks or direct feed tip tanks need to burn at least 10 gallons from the left tank before you switch. When you switch tanks, you've got a number of things that you need to think about and do. It's easy to reach down there, flip the switch, and forget about it. But the reality is that many fuel starvation events occur because of an improperly done tank selection. And so you want to verify that you got your tank selector switched over properly before you divert your attention too far away from the fuel system. The first thing I think about when switching fuel tanks in flight is, where am I? You may switch tanks based on a certain amount of time on one tank. There's a lot of people who fly one for half an hour, then the other for an hour, and then back and forth to keep the load balanced. Or you may do it in terms of gallons. I'm going to burn 10 gallons out of this tank, then 10 gallons out of that tank, and back and forth that way. But and it's handy to set a timer. Most GPSs now have an alert mode. You can set that in, and virtually everybody I fly with has that. Sometimes you have to be just a little bit smarter than the GPS or the clock. You may be over some pretty hostile terrain right now, and 5 or 10 minutes from now you might be over significantly better terrain. Consider where you are just in case something goes wrong. You want to have some ability to recover. So look at what's underneath of you and decide whether or not it's safe right now to switch the tanks, or if you want to delay shortly because of what's beneath you. I put the photo here of the very early Model 35 fuel selector / wobble pump handle here for a reason. There was actually an early airworthiness directive about this. This wobble pump, you pump it up and down to pressurize the fuel system. You turn it left and right like any other fuel selector to select the tank in use. However, if the pump handle is not all of the way down, turning it left and right doesn't switch tanks. So verify when you're going to switch tanks that your fuel pump is all of the way down, then switch the tank. If it's somewhere less than, if it's slightly upward, then you might think you've switched tanks, but you're still burning out of the tank that is rapidly running out of gas. For all of us, when you switch tanks, feel for the detent. It will have a little bit of a wiggle in its in position. Make sure that it's there. Simultaneously, watch your fuel pressure or flow gauge and your exhaust gas temperatures. EGT is probably the best single indicator we have here. If EGT start to drop, then you've detected you've got a problem. You need to switch back to the tank you started from and figure out what's wrong. So figure out, decide if this is a good location for it, switch tanks properly, monitor the indications, change the fuel gauge selector if that applies to your airplane, and then restart whatever timer or reminder you might have used. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to pretty briefly go through a couple of scenarios with the different versions of the fuel system in these airplanes. We cover these in the BPPP online courses, and of course, you can come back and look at these and do a freeze the screen and look at it in more detail if you want. But just a few scenarios about fuel management. If you're flying an airplane with an E185 or 225 engine, you've got about a 3-degree fuel flow return rate, and it's going to the left main tank, no matter where you're burning it from. Now, here's an example. We're burning out of the right main tank, and it has 20 gallons on board. It's full, 17 of that is usable fuel. And let's say, for example, however you've leaned the engine, you're burning 11 gallons per hour. What that means is that plus the 3 gallon per hour of return flow rate means that you are actually emptying that tank at the rate of 14 gallons per hour. And you'll run out of that 17 usable gallons in 1 hour and 12 minutes. And noticeably sooner than you might if you don't, might think you would if you don't account for the return fuel. If you have the 10-gallon baggage compartment tank in one of these airplanes, and again, you're burning 11 gallons per hour, emptying that tank at 14 gallons per hour, you only have 42 minutes to dry tank if that tank was full. So you'll want to switch maybe at about 40 minutes into it so that you don't run that tank completely dry and get a vapor lock in that long line to the aft baggage compartment. In the earlier scenario, by the way, if you were looking at, if you move your selector, your fuel gauge selector over to the left tank, you'll notice that that is actually increasing its fuel level by at about 3 gallons per hour. So you'll see the left tank slowly fill back up. If you're in one of these early airplanes and have the 20-gallon auxiliary tank in the aft baggage compartment, which is 19 usable, you'll run that 19 gallons dry in about an hour and 21 minutes. So do the math, figure out what your actual fuel burn rate is, add 3 to that, and that's going to determine how rapidly you are emptying in these airplanes, either the right tank or the auxiliary tank. If you overfill, if you don't do this properly, if you don't leave room in the left tank for this 3 gallons per hour return fuel flow rate, you'll overfill that tank. That fuel has nowhere to go except overboard through the vent lines, and you will be venting fuel at the rate of 3 gallons per hour, and then you don't want that. Now, let's say you take one of these E-Series airplanes and you modify it with a later fuel-injected engine. Now you have a flow return rate of 10 gallons per hour that you need to add to it. That right main tank now will empty in only about 54 minutes. The 20-gallon tank is going to empty in a little less than an hour, 54 minutes. That 10-gallon aux tank is going to burn out in about 28 minutes. The 20-gallon aux tank in slightly less than an hour. So again, do the math based on what your actual return flow rate, your actual flow rate is, and the return fuel in the airplane that you're flying. All right. Now, later on, it's still in the E-Series era and the 0470 H35. We're still doing a 3 gallon per hour return flow rate, but Beech started to introduce these wing-mounted auxiliary tanks. And those auxiliary tanks are about 20 gallons apiece, about 19-gallon usable each. They burn simultaneously, they drain simultaneously. So if you were to switch to those upon level off, they would burn dry in 2 hours and about 42 minutes. So watch for them to go dry sooner than you might think if you don't account for the return fuel. Modify that same airplane with a fuel-injected engine, and you've got about an hour and 45, 48 minutes of fuel on board back there. So watch for that. All right. Now, beginning with the J35 through the M and the first 2 years of Debonairs, the fuel return rate is 10 gallons per hour. It is, again, added to fuel burn. The difference here is the right main goes to the return fuel goes to the right tank. The left main goes to the left tank. The same time considerations apply to the auxiliary tanks, which are going to send the return fuel to the left main tank. A lot of talk here about tanks and return fuel in injection systems. Here, again, is why you want to look at the systems description of the airplane that you're currently flying. For everybody else that has a return fuel system, it's going to be about 10 gallons per hour return fuel flow. And it's going to go into whatever tank is in use. Even in those Travelairs and Barons that have independently selectable auxiliary fuel tanks, the return fuel still goes back to those aux tanks. So it makes it real simple, makes it easy in those airplanes. It's the earlier airplanes that you really have to be concerned about. And remember also that down at the bottom of my list that some of our airplanes don't have any return fuel at all, so you don't have to worry about it in those individual models. Lots of our airplanes, single engine airplanes, have tip tanks. There are two different styles or types of tip tanks. Those that I call direct feed tanks, in other words, those where you move a fuel selector to pick a tank or a tip tank or tip tanks, and the fuel goes straight from there through the fuel selector system and into the engine. Those are direct feed tanks. And then we have those that are called transfer pump tanks, where you use electric motors to electric pumps to transfer the tip tank fuel into the mains after you burn fuel out of the way. We'll talk briefly about direct feed tanks first. They act just like any other auxiliary tank. You may have in some of our models 6 different fuel tanks and a big range of fuel selectors and potential selections of the fuel gauges on the panel. So this is where you really have to be a systems manager and know how your system works. The aux tanks, the tip tanks will, in a direct feed system, will have 3 or 10 gallons per hour return fuel based on the engine installed on the airplane. And remember to make room in that left main tank before you select the tips, because that's where the return fuel is going to go. The other type, it's pretty simple, and both DeShannon and Osborne tanks, Osborne now owned by GAMI, have transfer pumps as an option, and with a transfer pump system, after you've made room in both main tanks to accept the fuel from the tips, burn them down to about the half level, you turn on a pair of transfer pumps, and they will pump that fuel into the mains. It varies from one model to another of pump. Most of the pumps transfer at about 15 gallons per hour. So I like to burn the main tanks down to about half tanks and then transfer the fuel over. Now here's an interesting scenario. Let's say we're burning out of the left main tank currently. We've taken both of our mains down to half level. We're burning out of the left main tank, and we turn on the transfer pumps. The right tank is going to increase by 15 or 20 gallons, depending on the capacity of that tank. So the right tank is going to slowly fill back up, whereas the left tank, let's say if you were burning 17 gallons per hour, the left tank is going to stay about level. It'll increase just a little bit, but the tank you're burning out of will stay about level during this transfer process. So keep an eye on your fuel gauges just out of curiosity and see what those indications are as you transfer fuel, so you become more familiar with the indicating system of your fuel injection system, or of your fuel system. Now, in this type of system, the fuel transfer pumps should automatically shut themselves off when the fuel is completely transferred over. If after the allotted amount of time the pumps do not turn off, or when the tip tank gauges show empty, if you have those gauges, and the pumps have not turned off, go ahead and turn them off manually. You may have a pressure sensor issue on the pumps, but they should shut themselves off when the transfer is complete. For all of our airplanes at top of descent, that is before or just after or just as you leave your cruising altitude, we recommend that you make that final tank selection of main tank or tanks based on the airplane you're flying. And we suggest you select a tank that contains enough fuel to fly your descent, approach, fly a pattern if that's what you're doing, go around or miss the approach, and climb back up to a cruise altitude without having to make another tank selection. What we're trying to avoid is making tank selections close to the ground, which unfortunately sometimes is implicated in a fuel starvation mishap when the pilot, under the stress of making an approach or landing, doesn't quite get the selector to the proper position. Once you've made this fuel selection at top of descent, don't change that until the airplane is either on the ground, or if you've missed the approach or done a go around, you're back up to a safe altitude. Put another way, many of us use what's called a GUMP check before landing. The G in GUMP stands for gas. You might verify that you've got the selector in the proper position, but there really is nothing for you to do with the G in the GUMP check, because you should have made that selection well away from the ground to avoid a fuel starvation event close to the ground. Lastly, in those 1974 and later Model 55 Barons and all of the 58s, including the TCs and Ps, that have interconnected fuel tanks. In other words, you do not have an independently selected auxiliary tank system. We suggest you do a short check of the crossfeed position, run in the crossfeed position for maybe a minute before you shut down. And the reason we're doing this is in these airplanes, there is no fuel drain in the crossfeed lines. If you don't occasionally exchange that fuel, it can become contaminated. And if at some point in the future you need to use crossfeed for real, you might have an engine failure as a result of contaminated fuel. So we suggest making a short run in crossfeed before shutdown, then going back to the on position at the end of your flight in those airplanes that have what are called interconnected fuel tanks. All right, so we've covered a lot of material, both fuel management procedures and techniques tonight, and I've got several questions, so I'm going to go to those. All right. Had another question come up and it popped me out of position. Sorry about it. Is it normal in an A36 for the factory fuel gauges to show different levels on the ground versus in flight? Mine are accurate in flight, but slightly off from actual level when sitting on the ground. No, it's not really normal. Fuel indicator calibration doesn't get the attention that it might in our airplanes. It is possible to calibrate factory gauges very accurately. For example, I've flown with some folks in Australia, and in Australia, they have a regulatory requirement to calibrate the gauges. I believe it's every 3 years, and to provide a placard that shows any errors similar to a compass correction card. In other words, if it reads 3/4, then you actually have X number of liters on board. So it is very possible to calibrate them. If they're out of calibration on the ground, I don't know. Now, the exception to that is if your alternator or alternators are not putting out full electrical flow, then the gauges, which are electrical in nature, are going to indicate lower than normal. And so once you turn on the alternator or advanced power, the gauges will come up. If with the alternators providing full power on the ground, you're still seeing something less than what you see in flight, I suggest maybe you contact ABS's technical advisors. Bob Ripley is spending a lot of time on fuel gauges now. Any of the advisors, Curtis, Louis, any of the guys can take care of you, but give us a call and we'll help you troubleshoot that. H35, both aux tanks feed at the same time, but not evenly. Can I stay on aux after one tank reads empty? Yes, you can. This is a common, there's a shuttle valve arrangement between the two tanks, and this gets hung up. This is something I've heard the ABS technical advisors talk about a lot, and they may be able to help you out finding a way to fix that. But if one of the tanks empties a little before the other and you still have fuel available in the other tank, you can still operate off of it until you get, I like to switch before I actually run it dry, because you can get a vapor lock in that very long line from the auxiliary tanks. All right, I have an F-33A, 1974. Why is it required to have greater than 13 gallons of fuel outside the yellow arc in both tanks instead of just the selected tank? The short version of that is it was a relatively arbitrary setting. It was actually the result of Beech's reactions to a lawsuit to set a minimum fuel level. When they did that, they proposed to the FAA that it be in both main tanks, and the FAA accepted that as a limitation. Limitations become part of the regulatory world, so we've got that limitation on both tanks. From a systems management standpoint, it shouldn't make a difference. It doesn't make a difference, but from a legality standpoint, it does. To maximize range, can you speak to concerns of running an auxiliary tank dry? Well, I've said that a couple of times here. Auxiliary tanks in particular have a history of causing engine stoppage, and this is wing-mounted auxiliaries as well as tip tanks. I've heard in some cases in tip tanks, the only way you can break the vapor lock is to take the fuel cap off the tank, which obviously you can't do in flight. So there is a significant historic hazard or risk of unrecoverable in-flight engine failure if you run an auxiliary fuel tank dry in flight. To avoid that risk, I'm going to make my fuel selection just before it's getting to its empty point and not wait until I actually have a loss of fuel pressure and introduce some air to the lines. All right, F-33A operating Lena Peak. I periodically get a momentary fuel flow loss that lasts just long enough to sense an engine stumble, then a fuel flow normal. Is this normal? Not really, no. However, depending on how lean of peak you are, I have encountered this myself. It's an artifact of lean of peak operations. It's not based on the system itself. It's the way that you're burning fuel out of the system, and more correctly, how efficiently the fuel is being combusted. If you're very lean of peak, you might have an interruption like that. So, I'm not comfortable with that sort of thing myself. I'd modify my lean of peak operation just a little bit to avoid that sort of thing. How quickly would the EGT drop if you incompletely switch to a new tank? That's interesting, and I need to film that sometime shortly because I tested this with, there was an air crash investigator who asked me to help him find this out, and we did it on the ground, but we did it at various power settings. And it looks like if you switch to something other than directly into the other tank, if you move the fuel selector only part way, the engine will quit after about 20 seconds. And that was a repeatable phenomenon. So I'd say and that's at full throttle, full maximum power setting. So 20 seconds, I'd say is probably a real accurate indication what you have there. And that supports why you don't want to make a fuel selection just before takeoff also, because that engine failure is going to happen 20 seconds later, which is not a good place to have your engine quit during a takeoff roll. Tip tanks should turn off by themselves when emptied. How do you know if it's turned off? Well, those tanks, they will have a fuel transfer pump operating light if you have those that type of tank system. And when the light is running, or when the light is illuminated, the pump is running. If the light remains illuminated, you can assume that the pump is still operating. All right. Last question here, and we'll wrap it up. K35, 1959 VTAL. When on the auxiliary tank, 9 gallons, usable each, level flight, I think it's 19. When on the auxiliary tanks, in level flight, the right aux empties first, and then the engine will starve while the right one is empty, and there's still a gallon and a half on the other side. Again, we're getting into that shuttle valve between the tanks. It should be able to burn the fuel out of the other tank also, but if it's not, talk to one of our technical advisors about what you might do to troubleshoot and hopefully repair the system. All right, we have covered a tremendous amount of information tonight. Thank you for staying with us. You can, of course, review parts or all of this program on the ABS website archives beginning tomorrow. This program, again, is recognized by the FAA Wings program. And if you want Wings credit, go back to the link you used to join this program in the first place. Click on the link to earn Wings credit, take the quiz, and that credit will be applied to your FAA Wings record. If you wish to get ABS Aviator points for this as well, take that FAA Wings record and email it to us at info@bonanza.org. or mail, or if you still do such things, fax a copy into us, and we'll take care of that for you as well. As I mentioned, this program and all of the ABS Web webinars are stored on the archives on the ABS website. The last selection under the training menu from the home page or from any page. And so feel free to watch this and the other, I think now 18 ABS Web programs or forward that link to a friend and fellow beach pilots so that they can learn more about managing their fuel system. For the American Bonanza Society, I'm Tom Turner. Thank you very much for becoming an even safer Beechcraft pilot.